Greetings. My name is Irfan Nuruddin. I'm the Senior Director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council and Professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. It is my pleasure today to welcome you to this webinar that has been pre-recorded as a discussion of a new report published by the Atlantic Council on the regional implications of the collapse of the civilian government in Kabul and how the region can see a path forward to create a peaceful, prosperous Afghanistan, in spite of the current situation of the Taliban's rule. A key component of the argument being made in this report and of our commitment as the Atlantic Council is that peace can only be brought if countries working together are willing to partner to support the women and men of Afghanistan. Our non-resident senior fellow, Hamid Hakimi, has conducted multiple interviews with stakeholders from around the region, and his research suggests that there are particular trends that should be paid attention to as we craft a path forward. Over the next hour, Hamid will lay out the main takeaways of his research, and then will be joined in conversation by 4 leading experts from around the world who will help us understand both the strengths and maybe some of the weaknesses of our current thinking, so that together we can have a stronger idea for how to make the world a better place, and in particular, how to improve the situation in Afghanistan. I will spare you the long introductions. All of the scholars that are joining us are well-renowned, and you can find their information on the website at the Atlantic Council. But quickly, our speakers today include Minister Manish Tiwari, who's a current Member of Parliament representing the Congress Party in India's Lok Sabha. He's joining us from Delhi and is a former non-resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council. Professor Jen Murtazashvili is a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., and a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Zara Ababar is a director of the Georgetown University Center for International and Regional Studies in Doha. And Fatima Eman is a non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and also a former non-resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council. It's an extremely distinguished group, and I've invited them to be as provocative and as challenging as they're willing to be, because we understand that while the goal here is to start a conversation, we don't have all the answers, and the goal, of course, is to get to better answers. But without further ado, let me start by welcoming my colleague, Hamid Hakimi, the author of the report that we are launching today. Hamid, congratulations on this report. It's a tremendous piece of work. Maybe you can take a few minutes to just tell our audience what you think are the main takeaways and implications of your research, and then we'll get into a longer conversation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Irfan, and wonderful to be here amongst the panelists. I will start off by explaining the rationale for this report and what kind of wider appreciations we've had underpinning the remit of the report. So essentially, the report obviously acknowledges the obvious, which is that Afghanistan is a landlocked country. It connects certain regions, so that's South Asia, Central Asia, West Asia, and the wider Middle East. So although within Afghanistan, people perceive themselves to be the heart of Asia, actually in policy terms, this is how Afghanistan is perceived, that it connects to these various regions. So depending on how the country is doing, it could be either peripheral or central to these regions. Importantly, we always discussed in the last 20 years, because of the United States presence and its allies in Afghanistan, the global implication of Afghanistan, especially in regards to transnational terrorism and things like that. But actually, it's very crucial to underline that upheaval in Afghanistan has had impact on the regions that it connects to. Whether those can be prevented or not, policymakers in these countries surrounding Afghanistan would like to think that they can fence off the problems in Afghanistan. But as we know, in a globalized world, that's virtually impossible, including with phenomena such as the climate change, displacements, and various other things. So that's the kind of wider underpinning that we have. Also, the other consideration in this report is that the United States and NATO evacuation from Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan that resulted in the collapse of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan in August last year, it has created a vacuum. and this vacuum is still there. And that in the absence of a proactive, clear, Western-led thinking on engagement with Afghanistan or about Afghanistan with each other, with the region, this vacuum is not going to remain unattractive to another wider set of actors, including transnational actors such as the non-state actors. We know Al-Qaeda and the rest. In July this year, we saw the drone strike at the heart of Kabul that killed al-Zawahiri. So that was a very clear sign that Afghanistan, should not be a place where we take our eyes off it. So we really are juxtaposing this report against these two assumptions, that Afghanistan has implications for the region has implications for Afghanistan, and that the US and NATO withdrawal has created a vacuum that will not be left untouched by others. However, the current US position is that the Taliban regime is not to be recognized. They do not. In our conversations for this report, also with senior US officials, we were not given any reassurances or clarity as to how long it would take for the US or what it would take for the Taliban to do for the US to recognize the Taliban regime. We do hear about the benchmarks of inclusivity, respect for human rights. So that specifically the 5 benchmarks the European Union actually had clearly articulated and others have kind of jumped on. But even when you speak to the Taliban, they're not sure if they met in a hypothetical world all these benchmarks, what then would be the reaction of the Western nations. And that amidst all of this chaos that we have seen in Afghanistan, there has been recalibration in the region. For example, some of these recalibrations have been challenging the perceptions that we held. One would be the China perception on China, that somehow if the United States or when the United States withdrew, that China would step in and take over Afghanistan as the hegemon and would try and stabilize it or would pursue its interests in Afghanistan. That clearly hasn't happened. Chinese embassy is active in Afghanistan. The Chinese officials have visited. The Taliban would like to make a big deal of the Taliban, of their relationship with with the Chinese. However, it hasn't yielded any tangible outcomes, particularly in relation to recognition or diplomatic support. The Taliban's sole representative, one individual, from what I understand, has been welcomed into Beijing to occupy the embassy of Afghanistan, which had been shut down. The keys had been given to the Qatari embassy. Symbolically, that I think is important. And then the Taliban took the keys from the Qatari embassy in Beijing. So that there is a representative from the Taliban in Beijing, but it hasn't yielded, as I say, any tangible outcomes for the Taliban. On the US side, generally, when I looked at this research and I spoke to stakeholders, there was a consensus among the experts and policymakers that I spoke to that the US has had a delayed reaction to Afghanistan, that things kind of took them by surprise. They didn't think that things would get so badly, get so bad so quickly, and that everything else has been a catching up act ever since 2015 August. However, there is an increasing understanding and acceptance that actually the nail in the coffin for the Islamic Republic was the announcement by President Biden in April 2021, when he said that he would withdraw all the US troops unconditionally by September 2021. And this obviously followed the other very significant event, which was the Doha Agreement in February 2020 between the Taliban and the Trump administration. And ever since the Taliban has taken over, there have been reports, including by, for example, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, that confirmed that the US-Taliban Doha Agreement marked the beginning of a collapse of morale across the Afghanistan's national defense and security services. And that the ANDSF, the Afghan security forces, never really achieved self-sustainment milestones by the time the US was withdrawing. So it remained heavily dependent on the US military support, and that also it remained heavily dependent on the US airstrikes, for example. That was a force multiplier, as it's called. And it really wasn't a case of the ANDSF not wanting to fight the Taliban and that there was a collapse of kind of conviction, but it really was that an issue of logistics and the fact that they could not carry on fighting. With Pakistan also, this is the other big player that we hear about the Taliban for years, that Pakistan's harbored Taliban's leaders, that's well known. You have the Quetta Shura, Peshawar Shura, Karachi Shura. Very famous events in Taliban history has happened in the last 20 years vis-a-vis Pakistan's relationship with Pakistan. And that as soon as the Taliban took over, there was a poll, and 55% apparently of Pakistanis were happy that Taliban had taken over the country. The support was the largest in Pakistan among the urbanite Pakistanis, which was very interesting. We debated at the time that if you ask the Pakistanis would they like a Taliban-style government themselves, the people who potentially celebrated Afghanistan's takeover by the Taliban, they probably would say no. But also Imran Khan was a major factor there, because he was the prime minister at the time, and he famously was quoted to have said that the Taliban had broken the shackles of slavery the day after the Taliban took over Arg presidential palace in Kabul. However, the Taliban's victory has not, again, just like China, we see that with Pakistan as well, that it hasn't delivered the kind of strategic goals that Pakistan would like to achieve. For example, the TTP, the so-called Pakistani Taliban's attacks, the Tehrik Taliban Pakistan's attacks on the country, on Pakistan, increased immediately after the Taliban took over. The ceasefire that had been negotiated with the Afghan Taliban's mediation in Kabul was actually called off this week, as Hina Rabbani Kar was visiting Kabul. So there is a lot to be seen there, that between the Taliban and the Pakistani government, and also the security establishment, crucially, we haven't really witnessed the kind of blooming and flourishing that was predicted. But most importantly, it also points to the issue that in Afghanistan, sensitivity among population is incredibly high against anybody who's seen as a so-called puppet or kind of in the hands of the Pakistani security establishment. So the Taliban are very much aware of that, and they also have to project themselves as independent of Pakistan's influence, although a lot of their leaders still have families and they maintain business links with the various factions of the Taliban, are still quite active in their kind of social networks with the various Islamist entities within Pakistan. So that's all there. But Pakistan is also suffering from an incredible, arguably unprecedented socioeconomic challenges in its modern history in the current period, and not underlined by the recent floods. And so with all of this, it's very difficult to see how Pakistan would be able to, for instance, in a situation where Taliban would require some funding, some support, the kind of lifeline that they require to sustain the regime, that Pakistan would provide that. So in the report, I'm not going to take you through too much of these details, but in the report, I talk about China's ambivalent friendship with the Taliban, the fact that China is a very risk-averse player, and that continues to manifest itself, that the Taliban and Iran have a balancing act, that they kind of need each other, although by all definitions, they shouldn't really like each other, because the Taliban are a radical Sunni extremist group, ideologically speaking, by our definitions in the West. And Iran is a Shia, a very strong autocratic regime that obviously should not technically get on, but they do because they need each other for various reasons. And I also argue in the report that perhaps Iran and Taliban maintain a kind of leverage against each other, which is not as visible in the other relationships, particularly that sectarian element of the Fatimiyun, for instance, brigade that Iran has. It could, in theory, mobilize that in Afghanistan to protect the Shias, for instance. And the Taliban having suicide bombing squads and battalions could potentially do the same. And then they have the water agreement and the border management agreements and things like that. They would like to, maintain the good relationship with each other. But ultimately, Iran is not happy with the way things are in Afghanistan. In particular, they've been open about their discontent with the lack of inclusivity of the interim administration that the Taliban introduced in September last year. And this kind of a guarded tale of a guarded accommodation continues with Russia, and it's the same with Tajikistan. Tajikistan is currently hosting, for example, the Herat Security Dialogue, which is increasingly seen as a forum where the non-Taliban or the anti-Taliban thinking comes together to argue for a way forward. So there's a lot to be unpacked. I'm not going to take you through all of this in the report. Uzbekistan was an interesting player in Central Asia, and I'd be very happy to hear from Professor Murtazashvili on this. I would be very happy for her contribution in particular, because Uzbekistan started off very warmly, and it has continued to plow on and say that it wants to see its dream of connectivity with South Asia through Afghanistan materialize, regardless of who is in power. But unfortunately, very few days after they held a successful conference in Tashkent, al-Zawahiri was hit by an American drone in Kabul, which shattered a lot of the reassurances that the Taliban provided in the Tashkent conference in July. So I think I'd be very happy to hear what Professor Murtazashvili says on that in particular. And then I look at the trio of Qatar, Turkey, and India. Qatar I see as an understated player here, because it doesn't make a big deal out of its relationship with the Taliban, perhaps strategically and deliberately. And then Turkey was very warmly involved at the beginning, but it seems to have kind of cooled off a bit. It has also been hosting a big chunk of the Islamic Republic's former political elite, who either held residency or had families in Turkey, and they just went and joined them. So Turkey's been there. In the report, and I'll conclude with this very quickly. In the report, we identify a few trends, and we say that what happens in Afghanistan and in the regional dynamics, these trends would dictate the trajectory of the direction of travel. One, we need to watch out how the armed resistance and insecurity is going to fragment or threaten the Taliban's grip on power. And I argue that as soon as there is a significant bunch of districts or one or two provinces falling away from the Taliban to one of its armed competitors, that would be a very significant development, as Afghanistan's recent history teaches us. Number two, I say that the Taliban's ability or inability to transform, to govern in some form of a political setup, that is acceptable to a largely wider element of society, that would be something to watch. And the more they fail to transform from an insurgency style way of running things, the more they will alienate society, the more they will alienate and create problems for themselves. And internal disputes within the Taliban is also often talked about. We're not at the point where I would say that they're fragmenting, but we have seen unprecedented, perhaps, disagreements, which they publicly have argued, including some statements on the issue of girls' education. You can take a cynical view and say, well, this is probably a detraction. They want to show that they're disagreeing, but they're not really disagreeing. But overall, the Kandahari faction, which is led by Mullah Hibatullah Akhund, the supreme leader of the Taliban, it seems to be holding. It seems to be leading with all these kind of conservative rulings that they do, and the rest follow them up. Repression against women and other sections of society is something that we always watch coming in sad news from Afghanistan, but that remains a major area of concern. I don't see the Taliban have changed their opinion, and it seems it's almost like a counterintuitive thing that the more we talk about it in the West, the worse the Taliban behave around this issue. Border clashes with neighbors is a significant thing because it has happened. With Uzbekistan has happened reportedly, with Tajikistan has happened under confirmed reports from territory of Afghanistan. So this would also point to the Taliban's inability to govern in the border management sphere, and that could really threaten the relationship and security equilibrium with the neighbors. And obviously there's some more, but I'll go also to, very importantly, the environmental degradation, things that are out of the control of the Taliban. So environmental degradation, droughts, and water shortages, both for agriculture, but also for the consumption, in particular in urban areas, that is impacting livelihoods. There would be things that Taliban will not be able to control, and they would really have to work with the wider society and international community to do. This is one of them. And the growing internally displaced population that could ferment into conflicts. And also the evacuees, it's a story that we closely follow in the West, that there is these thousands of Afghans who are supposed to be evacuated, and how do the Taliban behave in those areas. Very few, with your permission, Irfan, I know I'm running out of time, but very quickly, we also address some some suggestions on ways forward, and this is particularly addressed at the Western stakeholders. So this is not addressed at the wider world, is particularly to the governments in the West and led by the United States. So number one, there is no quick fix to Afghanistan. Unfortunate to say, but that is the reality that all of our research and collective conversations point to. And that Afghanistan is actually, what is unique about the current phase of the problem is that it's got a multidimensional nature. You know, in the past, you would have either economic, political, but this time it seems very multidimensional, and it has ingredients that it didn't have perhaps in the 90s, it didn't have perhaps in the 70s. So our current situation is pretty serious, and it has the ability to go out of control and threaten. And therefore, we need to think really innovatively around humanitarian support to Afghanistan. How can humanitarian support be geared to ensure that institutional erosion, to the extent that has happened already, can be slowed down, if not fully stopped? Or, for example, that there are innovative approaches to revitalizing private sector economy, because without an economy, even if it's a poor one, no amount of aid can substitute for the livelihood of the people. And that in Afghanistan, the civilian institutions have to be considered. This is one of the recommendations we make, that, for example, on disaster management, on environmental issues, on issues of humanitarian aid, how can we decouple the civilian institutions of supposedly state, away from other institutions that we do not want to fund because they fall directly under supporting the Taliban? So some of those things. And regional solutions should be sought where the challenges are truly regional. Again, here, the issue of energy shortages, urbanization, youth unemployment. There's a lot of work happening in South Asia, Central Asia. How can we plug in thinking on Afghanistan with all this other wider thinking? And last question, and this is not all of the list, we're very interested throughout this research and ultimately on the issue of leverage vis-a-vis the Taliban. Where is leverage with the Taliban or against the Taliban? And how do you deal with a movement against which one does not have leverage? And lastly, we would like to also pose some questions around this. That, our research, as Irfan said at the beginning, is not answering a lot of questions. We're actually trying to ask the right questions as much as we're trying to focus on solutions here. And one of that is, what role could Central Asian states play in maintaining a regional equilibrium by supporting Afghanistan, where, for example, India is no longer there, but India and the Taliban are keen to have some relationship with India, where, for example, Qatar does not really involve itself as much as one expects it to be, or even China and others. So what role for the Central Asians? And also, what happened to Turkey? Where's Turkey gone in all of this? Because we don't hear as much about Turkey anymore. It's a NATO state. It could have a mediating role with the Western society, with the Western states. And lastly, what is the implication of Taliban takeover for the transnational terror groups in Afghanistan, with implications for the region and globally? And at that, I will conclude, and happy to take questions after.
Thank you, Hamid. That is a magisterial overview of a very complex set of issues, and I appreciate the multidimensionality of the analysis. Just to sort of zoom out and then to bring in our colleagues, I mean, for me, a key starting point of this conversation is to treat the region as actors with strategic interests and domestic politics of their own, not just as partners for the United States or to do the United States' bidding, right? I mean, and so that a starting point that takes as a given that the United States and maybe the NATO countries more generally, with the exception possibly of Turkey, are going to seek a very limited role in Afghanistan, at least in terms of direct intervention. The focus on over-the-horizon counterterrorism has become dogma in Washington, but the notion that there would ever be U.S. troops on the ground in Afghanistan again seems beyond far-fetched at this point. So we have a very different equation than we have had over the last 20 years. The region is intricately involved, if only by the being prisoners of geography. As you point out, these are relationships that precede 2001, September 11th. They go back thousands of years. These are borders that, as are all borders, man-made. And so all of these countries have complex multidimensional relationships that that precede the current moment, and we need to take those seriously and engage them. So with that in mind, before we zoom back out to the policy recommendations and takeaways, I think it'd be useful to use our esteemed panel to really get a view from these various vantages, right? I mean, so as you point out, Afghanistan is landlocked, and we're lucky to have colleagues here who have expertise throughout the region, but also have particular expertise on the different, from different sort of viewpoints of Afghanistan. So let's start to Afghanistan's east and start with India. Manish, if I may start with you, India has long prided itself on the strong relationship it has had with Afghanistan, especially in the development sector. India is also, seeking a much broader role on the world stage and assertion of its rising global power. Definitely wants to be seen as a regional heavyweight and is always concerned about China and Pakistan, especially in the current moment. With all of that put together, how should we understand how India is thinking about Afghanistan, and what do you imagine will happen in the coming years? And I realize you're not speaking here in your official capacity as a member of parliament, but as a public intellectual. So any part of that you're willing to take, we'd be grateful for. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Irfan, for inviting me to this webinar on Afghanistan. And may I compliment Mr. Hakimi for his rather exhaustive and elaborate report on the evolving situation in Afghanistan, which I've had the occasion of perusing rather carefully. Before I come to the set of questions that you asked, Irfan, may I just go to a comment with which Mr. Hakimi made while he was closing his summations. Essentially, what is the leverage that you have qua the Taliban? And very respectfully, in my personal opinion, I don't think that there is any leverage. And the reason why I say that is because if for 2 long decades, the United States and its allies could not develop effective leverages and ultimately handed the country back for right reasons or wrong to the very people that they drove out in the first place, incarcerated them in Guantanamo Bay and at various other places around the world. I think it just goes to show that if anyone has leverage, it is the Taliban which has leverage rather than the other way around. So therefore, that being said, I don't think there is any point going back into history as to what happened before 15th August 2021 and why it happened and why it couldn't have been done differently, or rather in a far, far more sophisticated manner, for the lack of a better word. The fact is that we are now confronted with a reality whereby you have a Taliban government in the saddle in Afghanistan. How much of Afghanistan do they really control? How effective is their footprint on the ground? I think information about that remains opaque, and it really depends upon who your interlocutors are and who gives you a sense as to what is the ground situation in Afghanistan. So I think the critical question really is for countries in the region, including India, is how do you establish any kind of a formal relationship with the Taliban? Because eventually, if you want to stabilize Afghanistan, and you talk about the humanitarian crisis at large, in my respectful opinion, that is not going to happen till the time a modus vivendi is not found to at least have some kind of a formal relationship with the regime which is now there in Kabul. At this point in time, everybody is hedging their bets. They're looking at each other. They're looking over their shoulders. Tentative forays are being made. But if one was to go back into Afghan history, all the way to the Afghan Sikh wars between 1748 and 1837, and then the Anglo the Anglo-Afghan wars till about 1919, and then the experience that the Soviet Union had in the closing decades of the 20th century. I think the important takeaway is that Afghanistan needs to be left alone. And so, therefore, the critical role which countries around Afghanistan can play is to ensure that Afghanistan finds its own center of gravity, it finds its own modicum of stability. And if there is something which can be done to facilitate that process, that would really be a step forward in terms of mitigating the conditions that the people of Afghanistan unfortunately find themselves over the past 15 months. Having said that, it's easier said than done because of the simple reason that Afghanistan has been a playground for too long. And it's been a playground now going back almost 3 centuries. And so people cannot resist, or countries cannot resist from trying to fish in waters which have been now troubled for 300 years. But I think if you take a step back and people start desisting from interfering into Afghanistan, recognize the reality for what it is, whether you like the color of the beast or you don't like the color of the beast, that is the beast that you have to really deal with. And therefore try in their own limited manner to see that there is both stability and, if possible, some form of moderation, which looks difficult given the very, very tough stances which the more hardline factions of the Taliban have taken, especially with regard to women going back to, especially school girls going back to school, etc. But those are the kind of things that you have to work, or the regional players need to work with. Insofar as recommendations aimed at the United States of America, the Western interlocutors are concerned, I think, frankly, it's a waste of time because even when I was there in Washington, D.C., between 2016 and 2019, the one thing which was very, very obvious was that the fatigue in Washington, D.C. and the other European capitals was at its zenith. And now, having got out, an occasional Hellfire missile fired from a drone to neutralize a target is a different matter. But I don't think there would be any appetite for any sustained engagement of the kind that you really saw over the past 2 decades. So to sum up, because you have other panelists who may have more insightful thoughts to offer, I think if people just realize, or countries understand, that Afghanistan, the people of Afghans require their space. And if we give them that space, try and work to the best of our ability with whatever is the nature of the regime, and see that there is some sort of stability, I think that's really the best that we would do for the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Manish. I know you have to leave shortly, so let me actually come to you immediately with a follow-up. I would like to press you on your analysis of what role, if any, you think India is likely to play. And even if India is not going to be directly involved in Afghanistan, beyond maybe involvement in some development projects, is there reason to be concerned about the Afghanistan-Pakistan border? Is there reason to be concerned about China's role in Afghanistan? So, on the one hand, we can think of both India, the strong historic bilateral relationship between India and Afghanistan, and there is an argument to be made that as long as the India-Pakistan border remains hard and closed, India's access of Western Asia more generally, right, is constrained and could potentially flow through Afghanistan if things were in a different situation. So just kind of curious about what the view from Delhi is strategically right now where Afghanistan is concerned.
Well, Irfan, even at the risk of being in a minority of one, I have been consistently publicly arguing that India has no strategic interest in Afghanistan. And we should not delude ourselves into believing that we have any strategic interest in Afghanistan. Pakistan sought that strategic depth. They have got that strategic depth now. So they are welcome to be our guests and actually stew in that strategic depth if they want to. So it's all theirs, to deal with in the manner in which they want. And insofar as the Chinese are concerned, if the Chinese also want to get involved, they are also welcome to be our guests. So therefore, I think if over 3 centuries, people have not learned that Afghanistan has been the graveyard of every empire, then I don't know when people would learn lessons. And if you look at it, look at the kind of hubris that the Taliban would really be belaboring under, that in the penultimate decade of the 20th century, they defeated the one superpower, which was the Soviet Union, which ultimately led to its unraveling. And in the second decade of the 21st century, they vanquished the only remaining superpower, the United States of America. So therefore, if after this, if the Pakistanis or the Chinese or whosoever else wants to get involved, they're most welcome to. You see, insofar as we are concerned, even over these 2 decades, we were only involved in certain developmental projects. And that too at the invitation of the Afghan government, because we've had this historic relationship that you talk about. But the fact is that now with the current dispensation, if they do not want India, I don't think we should really be forcing ourselves on them. Because essentially, you see, what is really India concerned with? India is only concerned with the fact that there should be no export of terror, right? That is the bottom line that we have. And so therefore, given the fact that those concerns are actually nearer our borders than more to the east of them, right? Or more to the far west of them, I don't think we should unnecessarily be getting involved in Afghanistan. And if somebody has certain, very grand delusions of grandeur, then I'm afraid they will bite the dust. And I think there is enough realism in Delhi to understand our limitations. And that is why, whether it was Iraq in 2003 or it was Afghanistan earlier in 2001, when the United States asked us to put boots on the ground, irrespective of the fact, whatever may have been the color of the government in Delhi, the refusal was absolute and point blank. So to sum up, I think Delhi is only waiting and watching. If, let us suppose, we see a moderation in Taliban, if we find that there is a desire to engage, and of course, drug trafficking is, of course, an area of huge concern for us, and especially from the parts of the country that I come from. But then, given the very volatile situation that you find yourselves in, your options are really very limited.
Right. Well, I appreciate the frankness and really the braveness of being willing to be in a minority of one. It's why we appreciate you so much. Let me swing over to the other side of Afghanistan.
I'll take your leave. I'm sorry I could not have the benefit of listening to the other panelists, but I'm sure when you put it out, I'll have the benefit of listening to it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We're grateful for your time, sir. Thank you. Fatima, if I may come to you next, just on the other side, as it were, from the east to the west. Iran's role in Afghanistan, I think, is underappreciated in Washington, the strategic relationships. And, Hamid referenced the sort of awkward relationship given the religious sectarian differences. But you also have, in a sense, maybe a forcing of unlikely bedfellows because of a common antipathy to the United States and to the West. Iran right now is undergoing its own challenges domestically with protests of a level that we haven't seen in a while. What role, if any, can we expect Iran to be playing in Afghanistan? And maybe just to force the conversation a bit, is there a version of this world in which Iran is a productive force vis-a-vis Afghanistan as opposed to a spoiler? We'd love to get your thinking on this, as well as any other part of the report that you find worth commenting. I think you're muted. Sorry. You were... Maybe while you figure that out, I'll swing.
No, I got it.
Well done.
Yes.
Yes. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Irfan, and South Asia Center for having me back with you to discuss this fantastic job that Hamid has done. Congratulations to Hamid for the top-notch, really, and one of the most comprehensive reports I have read about Afghanistan in a very long time. You address everything from A to Z, and I truly enjoyed reading this and learned a great deal from it. So congratulations one more time. Let me focus on, as you asked, let me focus on Iran's concerns that Hamid wrote beautifully and adequately. Iran's concerns regarding Afghanistan, and then I will come back to the question. So the escalation of the extremist violence and deteriorating security that threatens to spill beyond Afghanistan's borders. Hamid wrote about that, the issue of transboundary waters that's getting more serious due to the climate changes, rising Afghan opium production, and all the way to Europe, and drug trafficking, and Iran, since Iran is the main route of transportation, and also the issue of millions of refugees and migrants, and some other issues. Although I think we could argue, but I really believe the main Iran's main concern is not the situation of Shia population in Afghanistan. Generally, Iran has viewed the Shia Sunni in South Asia differently from the other places like in the Middle East. Hamid wrote beautifully and sufficiently that those concerns he really I can't add anything to that, because it was perfect. And I would like to bring two more issues, we'll make it very brief, I promise. First, the time it has taken so far, for the Taliban to comply with the international demands. And also the second is Iran's internal affairs right now. I believe could impact the situation, the relation between Iran and Afghanistan. It appears that the longer it goes without a solution for Afghanistan and the existing deadlock not to recognizing the Taliban government, the more disengaged the Taliban gets. I imagine a time that the Taliban would not even care about international recognition, and some powerful voices within the group, as Hamid referred to that, would decide to bring in, large Al-Qaeda-like networks for their financial resources. That was number one. And the other issue I would like to mention is how the domestic situation of Iran has changed since last year when the Taliban came to power. There was a time when Iran's foreign policy was considered pragmatic when it came to South Asia, with Pakistan, with Afghanistan, with India, and it had support support of broad Iran population. You know, Iran's foreign policy in the Middle East, as I mentioned, is different, different species. But with Afghanistan, the issue of transboundary waters became of such a seriousness for Iranians that it could rally the public behind the government. This is why the government made it a political and kind of nationalistic issue and hid the fact that it had, you know, that part of the problem, a major part of the problem was due to the Iran's disastrous water management. And it was also, of course, politicized in Afghanistan. I wrote a report about that in 2017. So the Taliban has always been viewed extremely highly negative by the Iranian people. You know, the famous slogan during the 2009 Green Movement in Iran, as you all know, the dispute over presidential election was "Down with the Taliban in Kabul or Tehran." You know, the Taliban was really the ultimate worst thing you could imagine. And then the government had to sell it to the public that, you know, now it's time to just engage with the Taliban. And I will come back to that. The terrorist attacks in Baluchistan part of Iran and in the eastern part, in the both by back then Jundullah or by Jaish al-Ad or other armed groups, or every military clashes that happened at the borders with border regions generally, both east and west of Iran. And even the terrorist attack in 2017 at Iran's parliament and Ayatollah Khomeini's tomb rallied Iranians in support of the security forces. Now, you know, with what is going on in Iran right now, the regime has lost much of its credibility in almost everything. You know, people have trouble believing that ISIS was even behind the most recent attack on a Shia holy shrine of Shah Cheragh in Shiraz. And when people even accuse the government of, you know, being behind the attack to divert attention from the unrest in Iran. So it makes Iran more vulnerable, I believe. And generally, public, as I mentioned, supported the government policies towards Iran's border. But now there is a mistrust, and that could impact the security of the borders. So it may have also weaken Tehran in the eyes of the Taliban and increase the Taliban's leverage. You know, when I think of Taliban's leverage, they have more than the Iranian government right now has. You know, they can control, as they did in the 90s, they can control the flow of water to Iran. They can, as Hamid mentioned, you know, unleash this drug trafficking and the number of refugees and undocumented migrants that Iran used as a leverage on the previous government. It won't work on Taliban, you know. So now my question was, you know, if the Iran and also Pakistan and other neighboring countries may have also gone through some changes that has decreased their leverages. I mean, I can understand our colleague who just left when he says, you know, when you come to the conclusion that what's the point in getting engaged because there is nothing. And but exactly the opposite. I mean, it really makes it the issue more important. And I appreciate the fact that Hamid wrote, it really requires more resources into finding a solution. I mean, Afghanistan is not just any place. Afghanistan is a place, it is a very important place, and also where the interests of, say, Middle East and the United States converge. So I think it's more important than ever before to just get more active and find a solution before it's too late, before, as I mentioned, the more the time it takes, the stronger get the group, and it will be more difficult to deal with them. So I think I will mention it, will end it here, and let me know if I didn't answer the question. You're mute.
You think that 2 years into this, we'd all know how to do this, right? But you raised some really critical points, Fatima, in that, that Iran's own domestic politics has been complicated, but the current crisis that the government is facing limits some of what it can do. I also take very seriously your point that not engaging with the Taliban doesn't necessarily weaken the Taliban, right? If anything, it might benefit from isolation, but with no really good options either. So thanks for being once again so thoughtful and precise. Jen, can I move to you? I mean, you've been writing for a while now about Central Asia, but I've would love to hear your thoughts on all of this. But there's two thoughts in particular, two dimensions on which I think your academic work and policy work would be very useful for our audience. One is really where the SCO and sort of, just this new architecture of multilateral conversation that is very non-Western in a sense, and in which you do have these meetings at which you have Russia and China, right, the Central Asian republics, Pakistan and India, all sitting at the table in a way that you don't really see anywhere else. So what role could that play? But the other is this incredible work you've been doing on the challenge of state building, and that a really deep critique, for which I imagine you've gotten a lot of pushback as well, that the Western model of pumping lots of aid and humanitarian support actually can backfire, can have these really severe unintended consequences. For those in our audience who haven't read Jennifer's piece called Drowning Democracy, published in the Journal of Democracy, I highly recommend it as a very accessible analysis of how the mistakes in Afghanistan, she argues, are potentially being replicated in Ukraine now because of this tendency to use spigots of funding as a way of solving immediate humanitarian problems, but maybe without adequate attention to thinking about what the consequences are for state building. So that's a lot, Jen, but pick any of that you'd like to unpack in engaging with Hamid's wonderful report. Over to you.
Sure, thank you. And those are great questions, and I think I have a way to thread them all together. So bear with me, but Hamid John, congratulations on such a beautiful report. I learned a lot from it. And I think this will go down as sort of the definitive piece on what's happening in this region. And I like the way that you lay out, you treat all of these countries who are involved with really great care and great expertise. And so I really appreciate that. And I think we'll all be learning this from this. This will have staying power. So, I just want to begin by this conversation by starting in the northern part of Afghanistan. Rather than talking about Central Asia, I want to talk about the north. And, our colleague earlier said that, Afghanistan just needs to be left alone. Well, you can leave Afghanistan alone if you're not a neighboring country. And neighbors can't just leave Afghanistan alone. And there's reasons for that. It's not that they want to intervene necessarily, but they have interests and they have borders. And Afghanistan is a landlocked country. And to the north of Afghanistan are other landlocked countries, and including Uzbekistan, which is one of two doubly landlocked countries in the world, right? So when you're landlocked, you really depend on your neighbors. And so for so long, Afghanistan, was this site of congestion that really prevented other countries in the region from engaging one another. It really prevented, the conflict prevented interaction between Central Asia and South Asia. But before I get to those issues of connectivity, I have a question for everyone. And it's really about a policy assumption, is that, we've been critical of US policy. I've been critical of US policy in Afghanistan because of this idea that, all the US has right now are these sticks and, demanding inclusivity and all of these things. And we're seeing that these sticks don't really work. The Taliban are not very responsive to them. But the other assumption that I'm not sure we have evidence for is that carrots will work either, right? So everyone wants to offer the Taliban carrots and positive incentives. Do we know that that will work? Or, the Taliban have their own incentive structure. They're very focused internally on, building internal cohesion, and they're not necessarily thinking in terms of the same, their interests don't necessarily align. So inclusivity is a topic that the US has pushed quite aggressively, but I would argue the other countries in the region, whether it be China, Russia, the Central Asian states, Iran, Pakistan, actually understand that the Taliban have to be more inclusive. And this isn't for necessarily gender rights per se, or ethnic rights per se. They understand that if the Taliban are not more inclusive, the country will be headed towards another conflict, another violent conflict, and that is inevitable. And so it is in the self-interest of the neighboring states to pursue inclusivity, perhaps not in the same aggressive way that the United States is, in sort of this moral, grandstanding way and finger wagging. They're doing it very quietly. And I can talk a little bit more about how this is being done. But I think this is number one, is inclusivity is a means to an end. It's a means to stability for the United States. It's an end into itself. So if we look at China, before I get to Central Asia, talking about China and Russia are very, very important. And this gets to the question about the SCO, is that I think so much of the analysis on China, as Hamid pointed out, was so incorrect, because it assumed that China had sort of a transformational vision of Afghanistan like the United States did. And I think that is incorrect. China's interest in Afghanistan is self-interest. And self-interest is not mines or roads. China's primary interest in Afghanistan is security. They're concerned about Xinjiang. They're concerned about the Uyghurs. They're concerned about terrorism. Look at the amount of resources that China has invested into suppressing the Uyghurs, over these years. Look at the protests that have just happened in China coming out of Xinjiang. This is not a coincidence. So China is very concerned about its small border, about the ability of, worried about terrorism, worried about Uyghur forces, Uyghur terrorist groups, albeit they're very, very small, in Afghanistan, and the spillover effects. So for a long time, China looked at the situation in Afghanistan and said, okay, Russia, that's, the border with Afghanistan, look at Tajikistan's border, that's the most porous part. Russia has 10,000 troops inside of Afghanistan, has military bases inside of Afghanistan, inside of Tajikistan. And so we'll allow Russia to handle this. We can trust that these Russian troops will take care of this, even when the US withdrew. So when the US withdrew, there was a lot of panic in Washington. Oh, there's a security vacuum. No, there's not a security vacuum. There's plenty of Russian troops right there on that border. I wasn't as concerned about, huge refugee flows and so forth. That is a fortified border. And the Russians were maintaining it. Now, Russia invades Ukraine. China looks at Russia's military performance in Ukraine and has a lot of questions about those 10,000, alleged 10,000 troops that are inside of Tajikistan. Are they still there? We don't know, right? Where are they? I mean, Russia's obviously, needs manpower to feed its war. And the Russian military isn't looking as great as it once was. We see China having a much more active military presence in Tajikistan. Last week, they signed an agreement, a military agreement. And this isn't because China is expansionist or imperialist. China is worried about protecting its borders, protecting its own internal security. And so if we look at how these countries in the north, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, China, are dealing with Afghanistan, is from this perspective of, number one, security first, worried about terrorism. So inclusivity falls under that. I don't think the SCO is really an organization of major, is going to be able to do very much except provide a platform, because there's so much disagreement about the countries that are members of this SCO, even more so after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So Tajikistan now finds itself in a much more vulnerable position than it was in 6 months ago, or at the beginning of the year, because of the weakness of those Russian troops. Tajikistan was in a real position of power to criticize the Taliban because they had these Russian troops there. And I think Russia was happy to have the Tajiks on the one hand, criticizing the Taliban. They could sort of test some of these arguments against it, see what kind of resistance there was. And they were happy to have the Uzbeks on the other, sort of warming up to the Taliban. But Tajikistan is in a very vulnerable position. I think that border is much more porous than we'd like to believe. And we know for several years there were Tajik militants going from Tajikistan into Afghanistan, taking over districts, engaged in horrific acts of terror. And then what we've seen over the past 6 months of these ISIS groups or ISIS-related groups launching attacks, rockets from Afghanistan into Tajikistan, into Uzbekistan, something that never happened under the past 20 years. Never happened. So that's new. Okay. So then you have Uzbekistan next door that's looking at this with their, they're looking at Afghanistan as an area of opportunity for them because they are doubly landlocked. And for years, they have wanted this north-south corridor to be built. There were reforms in Uzbekistan that began in 2016 under President Mirziyoyev when he came to power, which really unleashed a huge opportunity for regional cooperation and integration. Because when Uzbekistan was closed, when its borders were closed off to its neighbors, it really stymied any kind of regional cooperation. It really hurt Afghanistan. It hurt the neighbors. When Uzbekistan opened up, it opened up a ton of new possibilities because all of a sudden the countries of Central Asia could deal with one another, and they had a very pro-Afghan policy under Ghani, right? Which was to bring Afghanistan into Central Asia. They see Afghanistan as part of Central Asia, right? Not as South Asia. They see it as part of Central Asia. And so to integrate this economically, to see Afghanistan as an opportunity rather than a liability, I think was a brilliant move on their part. And I think if we look at what Uzbekistan's doing, its strategy towards Afghanistan is probably the most creative of any country right now. So I think, to answer your question, Hamid, they understand very well who the Taliban are. I think they understand very well that, Al-Qaeda elements are there. I think they're under no illusions that the Taliban, oh, there's terrorists in Afghanistan that the Taliban are harboring. Of course they know that. And I think they also know that the Taliban are able to play both sides of this. So while the Taliban portray ISIS as an enemy, or ISIS-K or IS Khorasan, there are Islamic movement of Uzbekistan fighters inside of Afghanistan that the Taliban harbors. The Uzbeks know this. And there are these ISIS-affiliated groups who are Uzbeks and Tajiks. And while there's this conflict between ISK and the Taliban, it is to the Taliban's advantage that there are these groups there because it gives them leverage over their neighbors, right? It's very convenient. It's a difficult game for them to play because they can't overplay their hand, and the Taliban have to show that they can control them. But it could be to their advantage for them to spin out of control every once in a while. And we've seen this historically. So Uzbekistan wants trade, Kazakhstan wants trade. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are very aligned on this. And what we thought were that, after last year, it seemed that a lot of these infrastructure projects would be dead. TAPI, CASA, all of them. But all of a sudden, we're looking at Afghanistan and there's relative peace, it's a negative peace, right? And the regional countries, especially Uzbekistan, are saying, look, this is an opportunity. Afghanistan, what do you want? You want economic development? This is a great opportunity for you. Much more movement. We're seeing transport, trade, a lot of other things happening. Truck transport, even going from India to Uzbekistan, unheard of, things that were not happening before. So on the one hand, there seems to be much more political support in the region for this kind of connectivity. The security situation actually seems to warrant it for now, but there's absolutely no investment. And so the Uzbeks are running around asking, ADB and World Bank and others to support these huge infrastructure projects, which would be a huge boon, not just for Central Asia, but for India, for Pakistan. Positive sum gains, positive sum wins. I think this is a really important story that we shouldn't lose, take our eyes off of. But It's hard to do right now just because of the security situation. So how does that relate? I'm going to end this with state building. Really concerned about the way that the international donor community is approaching Afghanistan. Once again, I think it's becoming rentier. The private sector is going to be the engine of development in Afghanistan. Even, during the past 20 years, the parts of Afghanistan where I would visit that had peace, private sector was going gangbusters. And so, huge entrepreneurial spirit that we often forget about that country. We think about aid dependency and so forth. Hamid, at the very end of your report, you talked about the community development councils as a possible way forward. I really urge against supporting these organizations. I've written extensively about them. I think they undermine the resilience of the Afghan people. And if we're thinking about aid and state building, we have to not think about the organizations that donors support that make it easier for donors to interact with Afghanistan. I think that's part of the problem. Instead, we have to think about the kinds of organizations that build resilience among Afghans. My own research, I found that those councils created more conflict, created more corruption, created more fighting, and actually undermined the ability of communities to work with one another to solve problems. And I think right now we really have to be focused on strengthening the resilience of Afghans, strengthening the resilience of self-governing organizations, and that donors really have to be thinking about people and how people organize, not necessarily how they can best interface. And so often with aid, we tend to build things that we can work with, and donors tend to build things that work for them, but not necessarily for the people. So lessons also, for Ukraine, right? We haven't learned them. And it's not that aid is bad, right? I'm not making an argument against aid. Some people read that piece and said I was making a big statement against aid. I wrote with a Ukrainian colleague, right? But too much without oversight is going to lead to a lot of problems. And that's my concern about the amount of aid that's going in there now. Whose hands is it going into? Do we have the proper oversight for it? So I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for being willing to speak on that last point, and especially that subtle nuance, which is critical, that this is not a critique of aid, but aid needs to be in the service of the people, not in the service of the donors, right? And so, Zara, you've been so patient, and so with your permission, let me bring you in now. I think of you as sort of providing us really two unique vantages. One is as someone who does her work in Doha, which, a country that really turned itself into a critical hub for diplomacy and for evacuations, for humanitarian work at the worst of the crisis last August, but also as a scholar in your own right of migration in the region. I mean, one of the things that we've talked about, and when we talk about all of these borders, is implicitly recognizing that what crosses these borders is not just goods and services, but people. Pakistan is home to, and has been home for 40 plus years to a very large population of displaced Afghans who maybe don't even think of them as such, right? For whom this is now home. And so we have this diaspora politics that is itself part of the regional fabric. Would love to invite you to comment on any of that, as well as any other part of Hamid's report that you think is worth highlighting at this stage. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Irfan. My earliest childhood memories are of Afghanistan, as I spent with my family the first few years of life in Kabul. But because my research has pretty much very little to do with it, it's a wonderful opportunity to actually be here, being able to read about a country that matters a lot to me, and to be able to listen to all of you and be part of this conversation. I've also very much enjoyed the report. I thought it was a really fascinating read, very in-depth. And though, Hamid, you focused on all the different individual countries, I like the way you pulled it all together very coherently in those two main, the ways forward and the things to watch for. In terms of, I think, when I was initially thinking about this panel and reading your report, I was sort of trying to think of the regional look, as in the Gulf. The Gulf is one of those places that gets so super regionalized globally, and yet in reality, really is probably the most unregionalized place, other than its name, other than the fact that it has a nice, deep political name like the GCC. From from the beginning we know that there are different states in the region that have obviously got a range of perhaps overlapping strategic and geopolitical interests in Afghanistan and instability in Afghanistan. But I don't think that we have any sense of a coherent cooperative arrangement amongst the GCC states when it comes to both the immediate aftermath of the when the Taliban came back in, as well as the current moment. And I think that's not even, I mean, to me, it aligned very much with what Hamid was talking about when he said there's a lack of a focused, coherent policy amongst Europe, the Western states when it comes to Afghanistan at the moment. And I think that is definitely replicated across the Gulf. You don't see any coherent, strategic, deliberately cooperative response regarding how to support stability in Afghanistan. Even when it comes to the humanitarian efforts, they are not in any sort of collaborative form. You're more likely in the region, though, to certainly see Gulf states cooperating with another non-GCC state when it comes to Afghanistan. And I think that Hamid points that out really interestingly when he talks about the Qatar and Turkey axis. I think this is unfortunate, again, because the GCC states together, if they did adopt more of a sort of concentrated, focused approach, would probably be able to achieve far more when it comes to engagement with the Taliban and in Afghanistan. But again, it's not a cynical thing to say. I think most of us know the GCC as a body, as a regional body, has a certain degree of identity coherence, but it has never engaged in any coherent manner politically or geopolitically. And we know what the divisive issues that remain. Having said that, it doesn't, obviously we know also that several of the Gulf states have had a very strong role in engaging in Afghanistan. I'm not really going to address Saudi Arabia because that's an entire separate conversation on itself. But I think I will talk a little about Qatar and the UAE. Not so much the larger mediation efforts that have been, which are still ongoing, but I think focusing a little, because this builds a bit on what Jen was also saying, which is related to the humanitarianisms that are visible in the Gulf, and how Afghanistan is one of those areas that becomes a locus of focus for that sort of Gulf humanitarian effort, but also its humanitarianism, its visible engagement on issues which are strategic for these smaller Gulf states to leverage themselves on. So I'm certainly not saying that there's no ethical, humane desire for, say, the UAE or Qatar to want to do good work in stabilizing Afghanistan, responding to the emergency crisis there. But in addition to that, the sort of ethical good, doing good deeds, I mean, it is also broader. It's obviously strategic as well. But unfortunately, again, these countries tend to compete rather than cooperate in their efforts. In terms of the mobility factor, I think I'll go back to the evacuation. We saw both the UAE and Qatar actually play a really visible role in that, but much more, as we know, from that sort of lily pad transit state approach. The GCC states, Qatar and the UAE, have a historical aversion to providing any long-term settlement to any form of migrant, be they with particularly refugees. There's a historical baggage in the region relating to Palestinians, and so there are always those red lines and boundaries. The welcome, let's send planes in, let's save people, evacuate, bring them out here, get them processed through, but very much that transit moment, which actually, as we know, is not very transitional, as the protests recently in the UAE have indicated. And so I think the reason to not actually want to do more in terms of offering longer term forms of refuge here to Afghans would be, that would be one of those situations where the inclination or desire to look as though you're actively involved at a humanitarian level then starts pressing against the domestic political concerns of not ending up with having long-term Afghan communities resident here, and not only because they do not want to expand their population through immigration, but also because these communities then can start drawing negative attention, right? So the protests that have taken place, frankly, fairly consistently over the last 3-4 months in the UAE because there are still about 10,000 Afghans in humanitarian city there who still do not have visas processed, who still do not know where they're going to end up. But those protests take place on Emirati territory. These countries do not like having protests take place. And I think the reason they've got no attention is really interesting too, by the way, because you have to really look to find news about the protests. And the Afghans are also not necessarily protesting, from what I understand, conditions in the Emirates. The humanitarian city facilities and I think access to medical attention, education. I haven't heard anything specific that the conditions are deteriorating or have deteriorated. Hamid might know more. It's been more about get us somewhere, get us someplace we can settle. So whenever you do these humanitarian things, there's also the other side of it, the pressure it can place upon you. I'm convinced that a lot of the discussions that took place between the Western out there, big bodies, was that we'll do this, but it'll be super invisible. I mean, I've heard so many figures of how many Afghans have transited through Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and but we've seen none, and they just are not visible or present, have been kept completely partitioned from Qatar. In moving on from that humanitarian, supporting mobility, Afghans' mobility out of Afghanistan, the thing that I do think is very interesting in terms of the report, because it's a focus of yours, is looking at education. Both the United Arab Emirates and Qatar have, over the last decade at least, taken on this very proactive role in advocating for access to education globally, positioning themselves also as countries which provide very high levels of primary and secondary education, bringing in these international campuses, American and European universities, but also through the efforts of promoting education elsewhere. And Qatar, of course, has invested over the past 15 years, invested a lot in building up its education above all program, as well as the precursor, which was the Reach Out to Asia program. And I think that effort has been built upon in this moment following the Taliban takeover, because Qatar obviously has developed the Afghan scholarship program, whereby I think it sent about 250 university students to study in the US and in Europe, just over the last year, I think, since the crisis. And then the fact that the American University of Afghanistan has relocated to Qatar. I think at the time of the Taliban takeover, there were about 4,000 students there. So I certainly don't think there are 4,000 students here in Qatar. I think the number is far less. But it's obviously an obvious effort to say we support education, we're a place for it. These are, of course, still very small, elite interventions. These are secondary school students. We're talking about a much graver issue around primary school education. So if I were to say, like, one thing moving forward where the Gulf could potentially play a role when it comes to working with the Taliban government towards something better in Afghanistan for female students in particular, so the gender angle is, there is something different, right? I mean, these are Sunni Muslim countries. They might have a population where 90% are foreigners, but at their core, they model themselves as, fairly conservative religious societies, and yet have established and funded and invested in women's education and women's participation in the economy. And the UAE in 1975, the female literacy rates were about 31%, and they're 95% today. In Qatar, early 80s, the female literacy was like less than 30% in 1981, and now it's low, 92, 93. So they have a transformational thing they can also demonstrate, right? Which is, we are more like you than Sweden, but we think this is really important. And we have managed to do these things in a way that has benefited our societies. And we have not untethered ourselves from our identity, our religion. So the fact is, I think this is the controversial thing, because unless you have Western key stakeholders, transnational organizations, governments saying, yeah, we think it's a good idea. Maybe Qatar and the UAE should be the ones to be working with the Taliban on gender and education. You're going to get laughed out of the room in Stockholm. But the fact is that is something that I think could actually make sense, because a lot of these externally driven programs have become toxified, and people have, because the actors are toxic in some cases. So what the message is really important. If you really distrust the intentions, I think that's hugely problematic. So sorry, that's my
I think that's such a lovely
bits.
point on which you end, is that, you know, the region has many advantages in terms of the future, and at least one of them is that it doesn't carry the baggage that the previous actors did, and we got to think of that as a resource to be used. And so really appreciate that point, Zahra. Hamid, I hope you're pleased. Your report is so wonderful that it has elicited such generous commentary from leading scholars who have come to this conversation, you know, with such depth. But just to wrap up, I wonder whether you'd be willing less to sort of react to what they said, but more to paint a vision for the immediate future. As you think about the next year, the next couple of years, what would you advise are the top two sort of regional factors that we should be paying attention to as we continue these conversations in the months to come? Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm so grateful to everyone, and I rightly wouldn't want to sum up. I think, again, it's a very difficult question you pose at Irfan. It's probably a billion-dollar question. But for me, in my small way as a researcher, I'm very keen to see a few things. One is what Zahra at the end pointed to. You know, how can you talk about institution building, about, you know, things that, for example, Jen highlighted in terms of governance and issues like that, with a view that is not packaged as kind of Western modalities or external modalities that come in or imposed. Even if that is not the case, in many ways, Afghans have become very sensitive, and the Taliban-friendly constituency or the Taliban-unfriendly constituency, both actually, are very sensitive because they've seen the failures of the way that imposition of modalities worked, and they haven't delivered. So I think the region very much so, there's a commonality. People understand each other a little bit better. And it's truly tragic that it takes you 50 minutes to fly from Kabul to Islamabad. And that distance seems to be 1,000,000 miles in the last 20 years between that, or, for example, the distance between Washington and Kabul, which takes, you know, I look at these things in kind of very layman terms. And for me, that has been also the kind of the problems that we have. Like at the moment, we have the situation where the same set of issues affect these countries in ways that they share the problem, but then they don't want to work on solution building, something that Zahra also alluded to, right? So we need to, as researchers, as think tank people, as academics, I think, should really challenge ourselves. How can we challenge ourselves to step outside our comfort zone, and also conceptually challenge ourselves to kind of step away from some of the notions that are very Western, but perhaps also could really contribute to Western thinking in a way that it enriches it, not in a way that we see the West as the kind of the pinnacle of humanity. So that if it's a point to be kind of deduced from that, I think that's one thing I would say. More importantly, I would say as a theme, I feel that we really have to pay attention to climate change. And here, I don't mean climate change in terms of let's start have electric cars in Kabul or something like that, but really start thinking about its human impact, you know, health impact, the various other multiplying impacts that the climate. So Kabul, even when I was able to travel, you know, the lack of drinking water, the facility of like literally speaking to Afghans, and they tell you, we don't have drinking water, our wells are dried. And that then, you know, across the board in various parts of the country. And then the same applies to Pakistan, the same applies to Bangladesh, the same applies to Central Asia. So I think we need to kind of like wrap up this thinking that is stuck in the kind of post-Soviet collapse period and really bring ourselves to sort of the very kind of today and now kind of moment. And also agree that we have made mistakes. And some of those mistakes means that we have regurgitated, we've recycled the same things and the same ideas over and over again. So I think going forward, the challenge for the people like myself and perhaps some of us or all of us in this group is to, how can we weave things differently? How can we weave things differently in a way that it makes sense to the people that we're talking about or the societies that we would like to study? So with that very nebulous ending, I would hand back
not
over.
at all. I mean, I think the critical point made by you in the report, in your comments today, and by a wonderful panel, is that we need fresh thinking, we need fresh ideas, we need to kill some sacred cows, because the truth is we didn't create the situation in Afghanistan on August 15th of 2021. As many have been commenting, we were headed in that direction for years, maybe decades before. And if we're going to have a better future for the people of Afghanistan, it can't be because we are trying to do it the same old way that hasn't worked. If we're going to get there, it's going to be because of people like you, Hamid, and because of our wonderful colleagues. And appreciate you sharing your intellect and your ideas and your research with us, with this audience. To my colleagues in absentia, Manish Tiwari, Jennifer Murtazashvili, Zara Babar, and Fatima Aman, my deepest thanks from the South Asia Center. We are grateful for your intellectualism, for your generosity, and for your collegiality. And we invite our audience to read the full report. It is available on the South Asia Center website, as are numerous other publications and webinars related to Afghanistan. And all of our panelists today are prolific in their own right, and I urge you to follow them too. With that, thank you and be well.